Oliver Williams sat in the grand, leather chair behind his father's desk, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline. His father, John Williams, had built a family real estate empire from nothing. In his early years, John had struggled to provide for his family, and every decision he made had been with integrity and fairness in mind. Now, as a respected figure in the industry, John had passed down many of his values to his son, but Oliver, in his pursuit of growth and success, had begun to lose sight of those lessons. The office was a symbol of that success. Polished wood, framed achievements lining the walls, and windows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Oliver was now at the helm of the company, entrusted with overseeing the daily operations while his father took a step back. John trusted his son implicitly, believing Oliver would continue the legacy of honesty and fairness. But things were starting to change. Oliver, determined to prove himself, had become ruthless. His decisions were driven by numbers, and the human side of the business began to fade into the background. Efficiency, profit margins, and growth charts were his primary concerns. To him, if a tenant couldn't pay the rent, the solution was simple: eviction. As Oliver sorted through papers, his assistant Emily entered the room with a stack of files. "These are the latest reports on rental collections," she said, placing them on the desk. Oliver nodded, barely looking up. He was already thinking about the next big move, an expansion that could take the company to new heights. But there was a problem. A tenant in one of their older properties had fallen behind on rent. Emily hesitated before speaking again. "Oliver, I need to mention something about the tenant at 415 Elm Street. Her name is Margaret Hayes, and she's 2 months behind on rent." Oliver glanced at the file, uninterested. "Evict her," he said coldly, turning back to his computer. "We can't afford to be soft on people who don't pay." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, Margaret has lived in that house for over 30 years. Your father actually gave her a special arrangement years ago. She's an old friend of the family. He helped her when she was struggling, back before he became successful. Maybe we should reconsider." But Oliver's expression didn't change. "It doesn't matter. We can't make exceptions just because of personal history. Business is business, and we have to be consistent." His tone was firm, leaving no room for discussion. Emily nodded, though she seemed reluctant. "I'll file the eviction notice," she said quietly, leaving the room. As she closed the door behind her, Oliver didn't give it another thought. To him, it was just another number on a spreadsheet. Later that evening, Oliver visited his father's home for their usual weekly dinner. John had always made time for these moments, seeing them as an opportunity to connect with his son beyond the business world. As they sat in the cozy living room, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background, John asked about the company's progress. "Everything's on track," Oliver said confidently, sipping his drink. "We're finalizing a few deals that should boost profits significantly." John nodded, pleased with the news. But then his expression grew more serious. "How are the tenants? I know the numbers matter, but we've always prided ourselves on being there for people when they need us. Have you had any difficult situations recently?" Oliver shrugged. "No fin major, just dealing with a few late payments." John frowned. "And how are you handling those?" Oliver paused for a moment, then replied, "We're moving forward with evictions where necessary. We can't afford to let people take advantage of us." John's face hardened. "Evictions? Who are we talking about?" "Oliver. There's one woman, Margaret Hayes, at Elm Street," Oliver said. "She's months behind on rent. I told Emily to start the eviction process." John's expression turned cold, a side of him Oliver rarely saw. "Margarete? Are you serious? Do you even know who she is?" Oliver blinked, surprised at the intensity in his father's voice. "She's just another tenant who isn't paying Dad. What difference does it make?" John's voice rose as he stood up, his eyes blazing with anger. "She's not just another tenant, Oliver. Margaret was there for me when I had nothing. She was a friend when I was struggling to make ends meet. That house, her home, was something I promised her she'd have as long as she needed it. I expected you to know better." Oliver's stomach twisted as his father's words hit him. He had made a critical mistake. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. He had evicted someone who had been part of their family story, someone his father had helped when no one else would. And now, his father was looking at him with disappointment in his eyes. John continued, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "You've lost sight of what matters, Oliver. This isn't about profits or margins. It's about people. I raised you to be better than this." Oliver swallowed hard, realizing the weight of his actions. He had been so focused on proving himself that he had ignored the very values his father had built the company on. Now, he had not only risked losing a tenant, but also betraying his father's trust. John turned away, his shoulders tense. "I'm not going to let this go, Oliver. You're going to fix this. And until you do, I'm taking away your control over these decisions." Oliver felt the floor drop from beneath him. His father's words stung more than any financial setback could. Losing his father's faith in him was a blow he hadn't expected, and now he would have to face the consequences. The tension between Oliver and his father was palpable. John's disappointment weighed heavily on Oliver's mind as he sat in his office the next morning, staring blankly at the documents in front of him. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't just a business misstep. This was personal, and the gravity of his father's words still echoed in his head. John had not been exaggerating when he said there would be consequences. True to his word, John had temporarily stripped Oliver of his authority to make critical decisions about the company's tenants. It was a blow to his ego, but more than that, it was a wake-up call. For the first time in a long time, Oliver realized that he had become disconnected from the values that had once guided him. He had been so focused on expanding the company that he'd forgotten about the people behind the numbers. As Oliver shuffled through the paperwork on his desk, he came across Margaret Hayes' file again. He stared at her name for a long moment, guilt gnawing at him. She wasn't just another name in a ledger, and the house she lived in wasn't just another asset. His father had trusted her, given her a lifeline during a difficult time in his own life, and Oliver had nearly thrown it all away without a second thought. With a sigh, Oliver stood up, grabbed the file, and headed for his father's office. He knew he needed to face John again, to take responsibility for his actions. But this time, he had to show that he was willing to make things right. As he walked through the corridors of the company's headquarters, he felt the eyes of his employees on him. Word had spread quickly about the situation, and it seemed like everyone knew that Oliver had crossed the line. John was sitting behind his desk, reviewing some reports when Oliver knocked softly and entered. The older man glanced up, his expression neutral but distant. "What is it, Oliver?" John asked, his voice measured. I've been thinking," Oliver began hesitantly, "about what you said last night. You're right. I made a mistake with Margaret Hayes. I was too focused on the numbers and didn't stop to think about the bigger picture. I want to fix it." John set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying his son carefully. "And how do you plan to fix it?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "I want to talk to Margaret," Oliver said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "I want to apologize and see what we can do to help her. I understand now that this is more than just business. It's about the people we've built relationships with. I lost sight of that, and I want to make it right." John raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Oliver's words. "It's a start," he said after a long pause. "But actions speak louder than words. Go see her. Apologize, but more importantly, listen to her. Understand her situation, and then come back to me with a plan. This isn't just about a simple apology, Oliver. It's about restoring trust." Oliver nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. His father wasn't entirely closing the door on him. This was his chance to make things right, not just with Margaret, but with his father too. He left the office, determined to find Margaret and begin the process of setting things straight. Later that day, Oliver drove to the quiet, tree-lined street where Margaret Hayes lived. The house wasn't extravagant, but it had a charm that spoke of years of care and love. Oliver had vague memories of visiting this house as a child, though he hadn't thought about it in years. Now, as he stood at the front door, the weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders. He knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, frail but with a warmth in her eyes that caught Oliver off guard. She looked surprised to see him, but not unkind. "Mr. Williams," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. "What brings you here?" Oliver swallowed, feeling an uncomfortable lump in his throat. I came to apologize, Mrs. Hayes. I made a terrible mistake in moving forward with the eviction process. I didn't realize the history behind this house, and I didn't consider what you've meant to my father and to our family." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his admission. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Why don't you come in then? I think we have a lot to talk about." Inside, the house was as modest as Oliver remembered. The furniture was old but well kept, and the smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air. Margaret motioned for Oliver to sit, and after a few moments of awkward silence, she spoke. "Your father was a good man to me," she said quietly, pouring tea into 2 cups. "When I had nowhere to go, he helped me. I've lived here ever since, and I never thought I'd be asked to leave like this." Oliver looked down at his cup, ashamed. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Hayes. I've lost sight of what's important. I was just focused on the business, and I didn't stop to think about what this house means to you or what you mean to our family." Margaret sighed, her eyes softening. "I understand business is business, Mr. Williams, but sometimes there's more to life than numbers. I don't hold it against you. We all make mistakes." Oliver nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and regret. "I want to make things right," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's a good start. But remember, it's not about making things right for the sake of the business. It's about remembering where you came from. Your father didn't build his success on profits alone. He built it by caring about people." Oliver left Margaret's house with a new sense of purpose. As he drove back to the office, he realized that this wasn't just about undoing one mistake. It was about changing the way he approached everything. He needed to be the kind of leader his father had always hoped he would be, someone who valued people as much as he valued success. The next day, he walked into his father's office, prepared to share his plan. This was just the beginning of his journey to prove he could live up to the Williams name. The days following Oliver's visit to Margaret Hayes were filled with reflection. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just his decisions but his values. He had always believed in the hardline approach to business, one that favored efficiency and profits over everything else. But his father's words and Margaret's quiet dignity had stirred something deep within him. Maybe business wasn't just about winning. It was about people, about relationships, and about respect. Back at the office, Oliver's attitude began to shift. His employees noticed a change immediately. Where once he was distant and demanding, now he seemed more approachable, more open to conversation. He made an effort to engage with his staff, listening to their concerns and ideas. He had never realized how much his detachment had affected the workplace atmosphere. Now, as he walked through the halls, there was a different energy. People seemed more relaxed, more willing to share their thoughts. It wasn't an overnight transformation, though. Oliver still struggled with balancing his newfound awareness with the demands of running a successful real estate empire. He spent hours poring over contracts, trying to find ways to offer flexibility to tenants who were struggling without jeopardizing the company's financial stability. The challenge wasn't lost on him, but he was determined to find a balance. It was no longer enough to simply maximize profits. He had to ensure that the company reflected the integrity his father had built it on. One afternoon, as Oliver sat in his office reviewing rental agreements, his father, John, stepped in unannounced. John was a man of few words, and his presence always carried weight. He looked at his son for a moment before sitting down across from him, his expression unreadable. "I've been hearing good things," John said simply, folding his arms. "Your team tells me you've been more involved lately. They say you've been listening, trying to work things out differently." Oliver nodded, feeling a mix of pride and uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what you said, Dad, about how we can't just look at the bottom line. I realized that I'd lost sight of what matters." John leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "It's good to see you making that effort, but there's still a long way to go, Oliver. Building trust takes time, especially when you've been so focused on business without considering the people affected by your decisions." "I know," Oliver replied, leaning forward. "I spoke with Margaret Hayes. I apologized. She's willing to stay, and I've made sure her lease is secure. But I also want to make changes beyond just her. I want to work on policies that give tenants more support when they need it." John smiled faintly, a rare expression on his usually stoic face. "That's what I was hoping to hear. But remember, this isn't just about policies or one tenant. It's about leadership. You've got to lead with heart, not just numbers." Oliver felt the weight of his father's words settle on him. He understood now that leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about being responsible for those under your care. And in this case, that included the tenants who called their properties home. The Williams family legacy was built on the idea of treating people fairly, and he was finally beginning to see the value in that philosophy. In the following weeks, Oliver implemented a new initiative. The company would offer more flexible payment plans for tenants facing temporary financial hardship. There would be guidelines, of course, to ensure fairness, but the overall message was clear. They were willing to work with people, not against them. It was a radical shift from how Oliver had once operated, but the results were immediate. Tenants were grateful for the understanding, and it fostered a sense of loyalty that Oliver had never anticipated. One particular case stood out to Oliver. A single mother, struggling to make ends meet, had been on the brink of eviction before the new initiative was introduced. She had sent a letter to Oliver, thanking him for the grace period and explaining how it had given her the breathing room to get back on her feet. That letter stayed with him for days. It was a reminder that the decisions he made as a leader had real, tangible impacts on people's lives. As Oliver read and reread the letter, he realized something important. He was no longer leading just for the company. He was leading for the people who depended on the company, the tenants who looked to them for shelter and stability. This wasn't just about correcting a mistake with Margaret Hayes. It was about redefining his role entirely. One evening, as Oliver sat on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking the city skyline, he thought about the future. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a caretaker of a legacy, a steward of something larger than himself. His father had taught him that success wasn't just measured by profits, but by the lives they touched. But as Oliver leaned back in his chair, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had taken the first steps, but there was still a long journey ahead. His father's respect wasn't fully earned, and the trust of his tenants would take time to rebuild. There would be challenges, setbacks, and difficult decisions. But now, Oliver felt ready for them. He had changed, and there was no going back. As Oliver continued to embrace his new role, there was a growing tension beneath the surface that he couldn't ignore. While many of his tenants had responded positively to the changes he introduced, not everyone in the company shared his vision. Some of the senior managers, accustomed to the more rigid and profit-driven strategies of the past, quietly resisted his new approach. They viewed Oliver's newfound empathy as a weakness, a diversion from the company's primary goal, maximizing profit. One afternoon, Oliver was called into a meeting by Mason, the head of operations and one of his father's most trusted advisors. Mason had been with the company for decades, and while he respected John Williams, he had never shown much faith in Oliver. As Oliver entered the boardroom, he could feel the weight of Mason's gaze. The room was filled with the familiar scent of leather and polished wood, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But there was an undeniable chill in the air. Mason stood up from his seat at the head of the table, his face stern. "Oliver, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been hearing about these new initiatives you've been rolling out. Flexible payment plans, tenant support systems. It's not the way we've done things." Oliver remained calm, though he could sense the challenge coming. "I know it's a change, Mason," he replied, taking a seat across from him. "But I believe it's a necessary one. We've always focused on the numbers, but we can't forget about the people. We need to find a balance." Mason leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Balance? This is real estate, Oliver. This business is about property, profit, and growth. Tenants come and go, but our assets are what matter. Your father built this company with a strong hand, and we've always operated with efficiency. These new ideas of yours, they're making us look soft." The words hit Oliver hard, but he kept his composure. "I understand where you're coming from, but I'm not trying to make us look soft. I'm trying to make us more resilient. If we take care of our tenants, they'll take care of us. Loyalty, Mason. It's more valuable than you think." Mason shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "This isn't a charity, Oliver. It's a business. You can't let sentiment cloud your judgment. If we keep giving tenants leeway, we're going to lose revenue. The investors won't like it, and they'll pull out." Oliver felt the pressure mounting, but he was determined not to back down. "I'm not saying we should abandon profitability, but we have to adapt. Times are changing. People are more connected now, and our reputation matters more than ever. If we're seen as a company that values its tenants, that reputation will protect us in the long run." Mason's expression hardened. "And what if it doesn't? What if your plan backfires? Are you willing to risk everything your father built just to try out this experiment?" Oliver took a deep breath, realizing that this moment was pivotal. He stood up, meeting Mason's gaze head-on. "Yes, I am. I'm willing to take that risk because I believe it's the right thing to do. I've spent years following the old way, and I've seen how it disconnects us from the people we're supposed to serve. I'm not turning this company into a charity, Mason, but I'm not running it like a machine anymore either. We can be successful without losing our humanity." The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Then slowly, Mason sat back down, his expression unreadable. "You've changed, Oliver. I wasn't sure if you had it in you, but I see now that you've made up your mind." Oliver nodded, grateful for the small recognition, though he knew it wasn't a victory. "I have, and I hope you'll stand with me on this, Mason. I respect your experience, but we need to evolve. Otherwise, this company will stagnate." Mason didn't respond right away. He sat there, considering Oliver's words, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "We'll see, Oliver. Time will tell if your way works. But don't expect everyone to be as willing to follow your lead." Oliver knew that was the closest thing to approval he was going to get from Mason. He stood up, offering a handshake. "Thank you for hearing me out." Mason hesitated for a moment before shaking Oliver's hand. "I hope you're right," he said, and with that, the meeting ended. As Oliver left the boardroom, he felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. He had stood his ground, but it was clear that there were still forces within the company resisting the changes he was trying to make. He knew he would have to prove himself not just to Mason, but to the entire organization. His father had always been the unshakable foundation of the company, and now, with the torch passed to him, Oliver had to show that he was worthy of carrying it. Over the next few weeks, Oliver pushed forward with his new policies, even as whispers of dissent continued to echo through the office. Some employees, especially the older ones, remained skeptical, but others, particularly the younger staff, were inspired by Oliver's vision. They saw a future where the company could thrive not just through profits, but through compassion and connection. One afternoon, as Oliver reviewed the latest tenant feedback, he received a call from Margaret Hayes. Her voice, though still soft and composed, carried a tone of appreciation. "I just wanted to thank you again, Oliver," she said, "for everything. You didn't have to do what you did, but it's made all the difference for me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." Oliver smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm just glad we could work something out. And if you ever need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out." As he hung up the phone, Oliver felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be challenging, and there would be more confrontations like the one with Mason. But for the first time in a long while, Oliver felt confident in the path he was on. He wasn't just changing the company. He was changing himself. The tension within the company did not subside after Oliver's confrontation with Mason. In fact, the divisions between the old guard and those embracing the new direction became more pronounced. While Oliver maintained his composure, he knew that not everyone would fall in line. The whispers of dissatisfaction grew louder, and it became clear that some were actively working against his efforts to humanize the company's practices. But Oliver, with a clear vision and renewed purpose, pressed on. One afternoon, as Oliver sat in his office reviewing the financial reports, he noticed an alarming trend. Some properties were underperforming, and rent collections in certain areas had dropped significantly. The numbers didn't align with the optimistic projections he had set when implementing the new tenant-friendly policies. His brow furrowed as he analyzed the data, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. It wasn't until he looked deeper into the reports that he realized some of the properties had fallen through the cracks, managed by teams who hadn't fully embraced his vision. Concerned, Oliver called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. As they gathered in the sleek, modern boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Oliver stood at the head of the table, his face calm but his voice firm as he addressed the room. "I've been reviewing the numbers for several of our properties," he began, his tone steady but serious. "There's a pattern here that I can't ignore. It seems that in some areas, our policies aren't being implemented as intended. I need to understand why." Mason, sitting in his usual seat at the far end of the table, didn't flinch. He met Oliver's gaze but remained silent, his expression unreadable. One of the junior managers, a young woman named Clara, spoke up. "I think part of the problem is that not everyone understands the full scope of the changes, Oliver. Some of the older managers are resistant to the new approach. They're not fully on board." Oliver nodded, though inside he felt a pang of frustration. He had expected resistance, but not to this degree. "I understand that change can be difficult, especially for those who have been with the company for a long time. But we can't afford to let personal biases or old habits jeopardize our progress. This company isn't just about profit anymore. It's about doing things differently." The room was silent for a moment, and then Mason cleared his throat. "Oliver, I think we all understand what you're trying to do, but you have to consider the realities of the business. Some of these tenants, if you give them too much leeway, they'll take advantage. We can't let compassion blind us to the fact that we're running a business. If we start losing money, the entire company could be at risk." Oliver's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice measured. "I'm not saying we abandon all rules, but we have to evolve. We have to find a way to maintain our integrity without sacrificing the well-being of those who depend on us. And that includes both our tenants and our staff." Mason leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Fine, but what do you plan to do about the properties that are underperforming? We can't just let them continue to drag down our bottom line." Oliver paused for a moment, considering his next move carefully. "We're going to conduct a full audit of those properties," he said finally. "I'll personally oversee the review, and we'll get to the bottom of why they're struggling. If it's an issue of mismanagement, we'll address it. But I want to make it clear, our new policies aren't going anywhere. We just need to ensure they're being implemented correctly." The meeting adjourned, and as the senior staff filed out of the room, Oliver felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew the audit would be a challenge, not just for him but for the company as a whole. The old guard was still powerful, and they wouldn't easily accept the changes he was making. But Oliver was determined to push forward. knowing that real transformation required perseverance. The next few weeks were grueling. Oliver personally visited several of the underperforming properties, meeting with the managers, tenants, and even the maintenance staff. He quickly realized that the issues went beyond simple mismanagement. There was a deep-seated reluctance to embrace the new, tenant-focused policies. Some managers were still operating under the old rules, enforcing rent increases and strict penalties that went against the very principles Oliver was trying to establish. At one of the properties, Oliver met with a tenant named Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman who had lived in her apartment for over 20 years. Her rent had recently been raised by nearly 15%, a figure she couldn't afford on her fixed income. When Oliver asked the property manager about it, he was met with a dismissive response. "It's just business, Mr. Williams," the manager had said. "We're following the market rates." Oliver felt a surge of anger but kept his voice calm. "We're not just following the market anymore," he said firmly. "We're leading with responsibility. If Mrs. Clark can't afford the rent increase, then we need to find a solution that works for both of us." The manager had seemed unimpressed, but Oliver wasn't deterred. He worked out a new arrangement with Mrs. Clark, one that allowed her to stay in her home without the burden of an unmanageable rent hike. It was a small victory, but to Oliver, it symbolized the kind of company he wanted to lead. Back at the office, Oliver reviewed the findings from the audit. It was clear that some tough decisions would need to be made. Certain managers would have to be let go, and new leadership would need to be brought in. People who shared his vision for a more compassionate and sustainable company. It wasn't going to be easy, but Oliver knew that it was necessary if they were to move forward. He sat in his office late that night, the city lights twinkling through the large windows behind him. His phone buzzed with a message from his father, John Williams. "Proud of you," the message read. "Keep going." Oliver smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was on the right path. As Oliver pressed forward with the changes within the company, he realized that he needed to have a difficult conversation with his father, John Williams. While John had always been supportive, there were things about the past that Oliver still didn't fully understand. Now that he had seen firsthand how some of the company's properties were being mismanaged, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father's influence still lingered in ways that Oliver had never imagined. One evening, Oliver decided to visit his father at the family estate. It had been a long time since they had a serious, face-to-face discussion. As he drove through the winding roads leading to the estate, his mind raced with questions. Had his father been aware of the issues with certain properties? Had he deliberately turned a blind eye, or was this a case of old-fashioned business methods that no longer fit the modern world? When Oliver arrived, John was sitting in the garden, sipping a cup of tea as the evening sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. "I wasn't expecting you today," John said, smiling as he saw his son approach. "But I'm glad you're here. What brings you by?" Oliver sat down beside him, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something that's been on my mind for a while," he began, his voice steady but serious. "I've been reviewing some of the properties, particularly the ones that have been underperforming, and I've noticed that there are some questionable practices going on." John raised an eyebrow but remained quiet, allowing Oliver to continue. "Some of the tenants are being pushed out because of rent increases they can't afford. Managers are enforcing penalties that don't align with the policies we've tried to implement. It feels like some of these decisions were made long before I took over, and I need to know, were you aware of this? Did you ever approve of this?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair and looking out at the horizon. "Oliver, you know as well as anyone that running a business like this is complicated. When I started, the world was different. People weren't asking the same questions they are now. We were just trying to keep the company afloat, and sometimes that meant making hard decisions." Oliver frowned. "Hard decisions, sure, but that doesn't mean exploiting people who can't afford to keep up with rising rents. You taught me to be fair, to treat people with respect. How did we get here?" John remained silent for a long moment, his face etched with a mixture of regret and contemplation. "I wasn't always proud of every decision we made, Oliver, but at the time, I thought it was necessary. Things were tough back then, and sometimes, when you're fighting to survive, you lose sight of what's right." This revelation hit Oliver harder than he expected. His father, the man he had always admired for his integrity, had made compromises that had hurt people. But there was no anger in Oliver's heart, only the desire to make things right. "Dad, I'm not blaming you. I just want to change the way we do things now. We can't keep running the company like this. People's lives depend on the choices we make." John looked at his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You're right, Oliver, and I trust you to do what I couldn't. This world needs leaders who can balance compassion with business, and I believe you're the one to lead us forward." With that, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about assigning blame, but about finding a way to move forward together. As they spoke into the evening, the bond between father and son grew stronger. Oliver knew that his father had made mistakes, but he also knew that the future of the company rested in his hands, and he was ready to carry the weight. When Oliver left that night, he felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he was sure of his path. And as he drove back toward the city, the lights of the skyline in the distance, he couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than himself. The next morning, Oliver woke up with renewed determination. The conversation with his father had given him clarity, but now it was time to face the consequences of the decisions that had been made. His first priority was to address the situation with the tenants, starting with the elderly woman, Margaret, who had been threatened with eviction due to the rent increase. This was the same woman who had once been a close friend of his family, something Oliver only learned after further investigation. Oliver gathered his team in the conference room of the company's headquarters, knowing he had to set a new tone. The atmosphere was tense. Managers, legal advisors, and property officers filled the room, most of them unaware of the changes that were about to take place. Oliver stood at the head of the long wooden table, scanning the faces before him. "I've called you all here to address a very serious matter," Oliver began, his voice calm but firm. "For too long, we've operated in a way that prioritizes profits over people. While I understand that business is about making tough choices, we cannot continue down this path at the expense of the very tenants who have kept us afloat." A murmur spread across the room, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging nervous glances. "Let me be clear," Oliver continued. "We will no longer be evicting tenants who are behind on rent without first exhausting every possible solution. It's time to reestablish the values this company was founded on: fairness, compassion, and integrity." One of the managers, a tall man with graying hair, raised his hand. "But, Mr. Williams, how do we balance that with the need to keep the company profitable? If we stop enforcing rent policies strictly, won't that affect our bottom line?" Oliver didn't flinch. He had anticipated this question. "There's a balance to be struck," he replied. "I'm not saying we forgive all debts or run the company into the ground, but I am saying we will treat people with respect and give them a chance to resolve their financial difficulties before we take drastic measures like eviction." The legal advisor, a sharp-looking woman seated near the end of the table, spoke next. "You do understand this could open the door to legal challenges if tenants start claiming they were treated unfairly before? It could affect our reputation." Oliver met her gaze, unwavering. "That's exactly why we need to act now. We will be transparent in all future dealings, and where mistakes were made in the past, we will correct them. Starting today, I want a full review of every eviction notice that's been issued in the past 6 months. If we've wronged someone, we make it right." The room fell silent. Oliver knew it was a lot to ask, but it was necessary. The integrity of the company and his own was at stake. As the meeting adjourned, Oliver felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about setting things right for people like Margaret, who had been caught in the crossfire of corporate greed. Later that afternoon, Oliver personally visited Margaret's building. The old brick structure had a charm that reflected the neighborhood's history, and as Oliver walked up the creaky steps to her apartment, he couldn't help but think about how different things could have been if his father had known about her situation sooner. Margaret opened the door slowly, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Oliver standing there. "Mr. Williams?" she said, her voice quivering slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson," Oliver said, offering her a kind smile. "I came to talk about your situation. I've reviewed everything, and I want you to know that there was a mistake. You won't be evicted. In fact, we're going to work with you to make sure you can stay in your home for as long as you need." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she listened to Oliver's words. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I was so scared." Oliver placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. This was the right thing to do. My father would never have allowed this to happen if he'd known, and now, neither will I." As Oliver left Margaret's apartment, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. There was still much work to be done, many more wrongs to be made right. But for the first time, Oliver felt confident that he was on the right path. The company could still succeed, but not at the cost of its soul. And as he drove away, the sun beginning to set behind the city skyline, Oliver knew that the real challenge had only just begun. Balancing the legacy of his father with the modern challenges of business would not be easy. But if anyone could do it, it was him. Days turned into weeks, and Oliver found himself deeply immersed in the transformation of his company. The decisions he had made to stop the evictions and review the cases of tenants like Margaret were only the beginning. He was determined to reshape the business into something his father would be proud of, something that could exist not only as a profitable empire, but as a symbol of fairness in the community. However, the consequences of his actions were beginning to surface. The financial strain was undeniable. By halting several evictions and offering extended payment plans to struggling tenants, the company's revenues had taken a hit. Oliver spent late nights poring over financial reports, seeking ways to balance the books without reverting to the hardline practices that had brought them to this point. He was walking a fine line between maintaining the business and upholding his newfound principles. His employees, though supportive of the changes, were starting to feel the pressure. Rumors of budget cuts and layoffs began to circulate. One evening, as Oliver sat in his office, his assistant Emily entered, carrying a thick folder. "These are the latest financial projections," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "It doesn't look good. If we don't find a solution soon, we may need to make some difficult decisions." Oliver nodded, his face stern but thoughtful. He had expected this. "I knew there would be consequences, but there has to be a way to keep everyone afloat." "What are our options?" he asked, flipping through the pages. The numbers were grim. Profits were down, and they were rapidly burning through reserves. Emily hesitated before speaking. "We could look into cutting back on non-essential services, maybe scale down the charity programs, or even reduce staff." Her voice softened on the last words, knowing how much Oliver valued his team. He shook his head. "I'm not going to lay people off or cut back on the work we're doing in the community. There has to be another way." Emily sighed. "Oliver, I understand your vision, but we're running out of time. You need to find a balance. Your father built this company on hard work, but also on tough decisions. Sometimes, compromise is necessary." Oliver leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. He thought back to the conversation with his father, where he had promised to honor the family legacy while doing things differently. He had taken bold steps, but now the reality of those choices was starting to test his resolve. He couldn't afford to fail, not when so many were depending on him. The following day, Oliver met with his financial advisors to explore potential solutions. After hours of discussion, an idea was floated that caught his attention: investing in new sustainable properties, focusing on eco-friendly developments that would attract modern tenants and potentially bring in higher revenues. It was a risk, but it offered a way forward without sacrificing the changes he had made. The idea of rebuilding the company through innovation rather than regression appealed to Oliver. He saw it as an opportunity not only to stabilize their financials, but also to push the company into a future that aligned with his values. If they could successfully transition to a more sustainable model, they could regain their footing and continue supporting their tenants, both financially and morally. "We need to move forward with this," Oliver said, looking around the room. "Start researching potential partnerships for green construction, and let's see if we can secure some government grants to help fund the shift. It won't be easy, but it's our best shot." His team nodded in agreement, but as they left the room, Oliver felt the uncertainty hanging in the air. He knew that even with this new strategy, there was no guarantee of success. The market was unpredictable, and the investments required to make the shift would be substantial. Still, he couldn't back down now. Later that evening, as he walked through the dimly lit streets back to his apartment, Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about business anymore. His journey had evolved beyond simply managing the company. It had become a mission to prove that it was possible to lead with integrity in a world that often rewarded the opposite. And yet, the sacrifices were piling up. As he entered his apartment, he received a call from his father. Carlos' voice was quieter now, weakened by age and illness, but still carried the weight of wisdom. "Oliver, I heard about the changes you've been making," Carlos said slowly. "I'm proud of you, but I also want to remind you, there's a cost to everything. Just make sure you're ready to pay it." Oliver paused, absorbing his father's words. "I know, Dad, but I believe this is the right thing to do, and I think in the long run it will pay off." Carlos chuckled softly. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. Just remember, it's not about doing the right thing for yourself. It's about doing the right thing for everyone. And sometimes that means sacrifices that you don't see coming." Oliver hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had made his choices, and now he would have to see them through. But he couldn't help but wonder what sacrifices still lay ahead. The day had finally come for Oliver to meet with a group of investors about his new sustainable housing initiative. It was a pivotal moment in his plan to stabilize the company without abandoning the new values he had instilled. The sleek boardroom was filled with serious faces, investors who had come to hear his pitch. Oliver stood at the head of the room, confident yet anxious. He knew that this meeting would determine the future of the company and his ability to fulfill the promises he had made to himself and to his father. As he began his presentation, outlining the potential benefits of investing in eco-friendly properties, the room was quiet, the only sound being the occasional scribble of notes. Oliver could see their skepticism. They were traditional investors, used to high returns on short-term projects, and what he was proposing was a long-term shift that required faith in something new. But Oliver pressed on, explaining how this initiative would not only modernize the company, but also create a new image of responsibility and care for both the environment and the community. Halfway through his speech, Oliver saw one of the older investors raise a hand, interrupting his flow. "Mr. Prescott, you speak about sustainability and community, but where's the profit? This all sounds noble, but how do we know this will actually bring in the returns we expect?" Oliver hesitated for a brief moment, but then answered with certainty, "I won't lie. This won't be an overnight success. But the world is changing. Consumers are looking for companies that align with their values, and tenants are becoming more aware of the impact their living choices have on the environment. If we position ourselves now, we'll be ahead of the curve, and the profits will come as this demand grows." The investor leaned back in his chair, clearly not convinced. Oliver could feel the tension in the room rise. But before he could continue, the door opened, and to his surprise, his father, Carlos, walked in, supported by a cane but standing tall. The room fell silent as the elder Prescott made his way to the front, nodding to the investors. Carlos turned to his son, a small, approving smile on his face. "Oliver, may I say a few words?" Oliver, surprised but grateful, stepped aside. His father addressed the room, his voice firm but gentle, the voice of a man who had seen it all in business. "I understand your concerns," Carlos began, looking directly at the skeptical investors. "You're here because you've always trusted in returns. You've built your careers on numbers, as have I. But I've also learned something in my years. Sometimes, the greatest returns don't come from chasing immediate profit. They come from investing in something bigger than yourself." He paused, letting his words sink in. Oliver has a vision, one that I admit, at first, I didn't fully understand. But over time, I've come to realize that what he's doing isn't just good business. It's necessary. The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we'll be left behind. You may not see the profits today, but trust me, if you invest in the future, those returns will come. The room was still, every eye fixed on Carlos. His words carried a weight that only decades of experience could bring. Oliver watched his father in awe, realizing that, despite their differences, they were more alike than he had thought. Carlos had taught him that success wasn't just about wealth. It was about legacy, about leaving something behind that others could build on. When Carlos finished, the mood in the room had shifted. The investors, though still cautious, seemed more open. The meeting concluded with promises of follow-up discussions, and while no immediate deals were signed, Oliver felt a sense of accomplishment. He had presented his case honestly, and with his father's support, he knew they had laid the groundwork for something meaningful. As they left the building, Carlos turned to his son, his face showing signs of exhaustion but also pride. "You did well in there, Oliver. Better than I could have expected. But don't forget, this is just the beginning. There's still much to do." Oliver nodded, his heart full. "I know, Dad, and I'm ready for it." That night, as Oliver sat in his office, he reflected on how far they had come. From the brink of losing everything to standing on the verge of a new future, he realized that the hardest battles weren't always against competitors or market forces. They were the battles within. His father's presence had reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey. They had both made mistakes, but they were learning, growing together as men, as family. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Oliver felt at peace with the path ahead. He had learned from his father's wisdom, and now it was his turn to carry that forward. He picked up the phone to call Margaret, knowing that this was just the start of the change he wanted to make in the lives of the people who depended on him. Weeks had passed since the meeting with the investors, and Oliver found himself standing in front of the small, yet beautifully restored home that once belonged to Miss Dawson. It had been one of his father's oldest properties, a symbol of kindness and generosity. Now, Oliver had made sure the legacy continued. Ms. Dawson's situation had been resolved. Her home had been saved, and Oliver had ensured that she would never have to worry about rent again. It was his way of righting the wrongs, both his and his father's. As he knocked on the door, Margaret opened it with a wide smile, her eyes glowing with relief and gratitude. She hugged Oliver tightly, thanking him for everything he had done. Ms. Dawson, who was sitting by the window in a rocking chair, waved him over with a warm smile. "You saved this house," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Your father would be proud." The words hit Oliver in a way he hadn't expected. He had always strived to make his father proud, but now it wasn't just about business. It was about values, about doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. "I hope so," Oliver replied humbly. "But there's still a lot more I need to learn." Leaving the house that afternoon, Oliver realized that this journey had changed him. He had started out as someone who believed that wealth and power were the true markers of success. But over the past months, he had learned that real success was about the impact you made on people's lives. It was about compassion, integrity, and understanding that true wealth comes from the trust and respect you earn. Back at the office, things were different too. Carlos had officially handed over the reins to Oliver, but it wasn't without his guidance. Despite his health setbacks, Carlos still had a sharp mind for business, and he was always ready to offer advice whenever Oliver needed it. Their relationship had shifted from one of father and son to something more equal, more collaborative. They were partners now, not just in business, but in life. One day, while they were reviewing some documents, Carlos looked over at Oliver. "You know," he said, "I made a lot of mistakes, pushed too hard, focused too much on the bottom line. But you're building something better. You're doing what I never could." Oliver looked at his father, the man who had always seemed invincible, but who now appeared more human than ever. "I'm only doing what you taught me, Dad. You showed me that it's possible to rebuild after failure, to make amends, and to move forward with integrity." Carlos smiled, the weight of his years of experience visible in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, son." The words filled Oliver with a sense of peace. He had spent so much of his life chasing approval, but now he realized that what mattered most was staying true to the values he had learned along the way. With his father by his side, guiding him, and Margaret's unwavering support, Oliver felt ready for whatever came next. As he looked out the window of his office, the city skyline stretching out before him, Oliver knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to face. But now, he understood that every decision, every action, had the power to make a real difference in people's lives. And that, more than anything, was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. With renewed purpose, Oliver returned to his desk, already planning the next steps for the sustainable housing project. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for Prescott Properties, and for him, enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.